Hi, my name is Jose Antonio Ortoni Gomez Ibanez, and the class you're going to be seeing is a class in a course on transportation and infrastructure policy. It's about in the middle of the course, and it's between two sections. It's the end of a section on land use and infrastructure and the beginning of a section on privatization and the role of the public and private sectors. The case I picked for this class is about Argentina. I use it to begin the section on privatization because it's a rather dramatic case. But Argentina went farther in transport than anybody else. Right? It was the only one to privatize commuter railways. Argentina really adopted a radical set of reforms, and so the students get to see these reforms in action. Argentina to look at it, right, and to say, do we want to do this? Do we want to follow in what they're doing? And that's what I'd like you to imagine yourself doing today, trying to report back to your home country. Even with a case that I've taught many, many times, I feel like I have to prepare. The important thing that I do is first reread my old teaching notes, then reread the case, and then handwrite a new set of notes. I handwrite them so that they're imprinted in my brain. When I'm thinking about how to teach a case, the most important thing is the end, is the issues that you want the students to walk away from a class thinking about. And the second most important thing is the sets of conversations, the blocks of conversations, or some people call them the pastures, in which the students have to graze for a while to get to the end that you want, to get to the issues that you want them to think about and retain. The basic thing is, what do you want the wrap-up to be? And what conversations do the students need to have to get there? Usually, a conversation is between 20 and 30 minutes, so you can think of having 2 to 4 blocks in a class, not counting the wrap-up or the beginning intro. You need at least 15 or 20 minutes to discuss anything of merit, and so you can't have too many blocks in a class. So this is a transition point in the course, right? The last 3 cases we did were about land use and transportation. The beginning and the end of the classes are really important. The first 5 minutes I usually spend setting the context, reminding them of the case that we did the previous class and how this case fits into the curriculum. And it's important both for continuity and for shaping the conversation that's going to follow. I think spending more than 5 minutes on an introduction gives the wrong flavor to the class, right? This is not a lecture. This is a discussion, and the introduction can be brief and to the point. Yet at the same time, it's important to have an introduction, right? To help them understand why we're studying this topic in the course, not just why we're looking at this case. This first case on Argentina is on the kind of political economy of privatization. Sort of who wins, who loses, what happens, and how we understand it. In my plan for this case, there are 3 blocks. One is to discuss who wins and who loses from privatization using the railroads as the example. The second, who wins and who loses using the highways as the example, because it's different and it's important for the students to see that. And finally, to talk about the system of regulating these private utilities, the concession system, because that's an interesting issue that we need to explore more in the course. But let me suggest that we talk first about the railroad industry, in part because it's the one that you know the most about. And somebody warm us up before we talk about whether this was a success or not and for whom. Somebody warm us up by telling us what they did to the railroad industry. What was the restructuring? What were the concession Dominic? Sometimes you want to ask them an easy factual question just to warm them up, particularly if it's a class new to case discussion. I think you want to ask the engaging question, or at least tell them that where we're headed is to that engaging question, if you're really going to motivate the discussion. So what do you think? I mean, if you were reporting back to the railway ministry in India or Malaysia or wherever, success or not, and for whom? Who won and who lost in this privatization? I typically launch the conversation by asking them a provocative question, and then it's important to wait until they respond. You should wait because they'll eventually respond. And you should wait because if the question is interesting and provocative, it may take them a few minutes to formulate the response. When the student responds, I think it's important to try and get other students to respond to him or her. And so I'll turn to the rest of the class and say, what do you think? Or I may summarize the student's comment in a particularly provocative way that I know will elicit a reaction from somebody in the class. But the thing I try and avoid is answering the student's comment myself.
Moreover, you're not only giving them 2 years of pay, you're giving them time. And I don't want to sound like Milton Friedman, but you're free to choose. You've got 2 years of pay and time on your hands. If you're not, getting yourself reskilled and retooled,
New age.
there's something wrong with you. Or even just leave the country.
So you don't feel so badly for them because these must have been make-work jobs, or?
They were very long coffee breaks. If you're cutting the head count by 80%, I'll tell you, those were not jobs.
What do you think, Kathleen?
Well, I mean, I think from the perspective of the sort of the government, it's less an issue of like the individual welfare and more the idea that there's a collective group of people that all don't have jobs who get really angry and have a coup or vote them out of office. And sort of a continuous system where you have sort of a history of that happening, sort of demonstrating in the streets.
Kevin, are you on this? I look for somebody who hasn't been raising his hand all the time, somebody who hasn't been participating. And then I'll ask them often, particularly if I'm unsure of how they're going to react, are you on this issue? Are you on this point? Sometimes they'll say no, and then I'll say, well, let's come back to your issue after we've discussed the point we're pursuing. If a student makes a comment that raises a whole nother issue, what I may do is go to the section of the board where I plan to have that discussion, write that issue on the board, and say, let's flag that. I'd like to come back to that, but let's stick with the topic we've got for a while more. It's important at the outset to make clear the rules of the game for participation in the class. And I tell them that I expect the participation to be brief and on point, but that they don't have to have the answer perfectly when they participate. And then that in fact, sometimes the student who crawls out on a limb and makes a provocative point that many of his classmates will disagree with does the most to advance the understanding of the class. I tell them quality counts, but bravery is a big part of quality. Let's talk a little bit about the way to react to a student comment. If you think that the student made a very interesting point, but that other people didn't really appreciate it, you can say, explain that a little more, or let's follow that further, or do others understand the point that Sam is making? Or if you think it's maybe an off-the-wall remark, then you can say, what do the rest of you think? What are the implications of this? Does this fit with what Betty was saying? But the thing that you want to do is not be disrespectful, yet be intellectually challenging and help the class engage with the comment that the student just made. I think one mistake that rookie case teachers make is treating every comment equally, as if it has equal validity or usefulness to the argument and the conversation. And when you do that, then the students get the sense that there are no standards in the classroom. You need to think a little bit about the transitions between the blocks or the sections of the course. And what I usually do is try and summarize briefly the conversation that we've had in the block and maybe generalize it a little bit. The profit motive without competition leads to politically difficult results, right? Greed is great as long as there's a little fear that makes you share the difference. And part of this is, as Fran says, the concession system, right, which is forcing them to compete for these concessions. Part of it is there's competition outside the concession system, like the trucks. Let's just briefly think about That's the other mode that you know the most about in the case. Somebody briefly take us through what they did in highways, and then tell me whether people won or lost. Deanne. One of the things that's important is to watch the clock a little bit, to be aware. It's easy when the issues are fascinating to spend too long on a particular block. And so you want to make sure that you wrap up in time to do the other blocks that you need to have. But you also don't want to close down a block until it's ripe. You can get a sense for when the students have really explored the issue. What other issues? I'm not very good at body language and using gestures, but I like to come close to the students, walk up the aisles, and stand near a student who's talking, because it expresses my engagement in the conversation, and it heightens the tension in the room as well. 92,000.
92,000, down to 19,500 total.
To 19,000. So 73,000 workers cut from the railroad industry. And as Sharif says, we expect even more. The board plan is critical. What I like to do is have every block of the conversation have its own space on the board, and have a plan so that nothing has to be erased, so that you can refer back to old parts of the conversation later in the class and in the wrap-up. I try usually to write every student's comment on the board, at least some version of it or some portion of it. In particular, I don't want people to get the impression that I only write the comments I agree with on the board, because then the class becomes a game of trying to see who can get Tony to write something on the board rather than understanding the issues involved. So you say I'm using minus for hurt and plus for helped, right? So you say intercity passengers were hurt because a lot of track was abandoned, a lot of services were abandoned. I think putting every comment, almost every comment on the board, it's a sign of respect, and that the conversation is not one that I'm trying to micromanage. So this doesn't seem like a bad result from the board can be a fabulous visual aid to the conversation, helping students keep track of the comments and where the conversation's been and where it's going. You'll notice in this class that one student says that labor won in the privatization of the railways, and so we put a plus next to labor. But 15 minutes later, students realized that that was wrong, and so we changed the plus to a minus. Your premise is that we were wrong to say this was a plus. You and Shuba...
If you're reading from the worker, if I was the railroad worker, I don't see myself getting a job very quickly right now in the economies.
I use pluses and minuses and compare the railroads and the highways in this class, and I think it makes it much more effective for them to follow the conversation. I usually try and break up the board space that I have into the blocks of the conversation, so that each block has its own place on the board. Now, you got to be careful about the counterfactual. That's really useful, because then at the wrap-up you can refer back to the conversations and remind people of what they said, because it's on the board. And if you're trying to compare apples and oranges, or block A and block B, then you've got a visual record of what the students said. But notice this pattern as opposed to this, right? Here it's win-win. Here it's win-lose. Here it's... These are the two typical patterns of the privatization of an existing state-owned enterprise, an existing railway, an existing water company, an existing electricity company, versus new infrastructure. One of the things that makes this case work is that it raises issues that tug at the heart. 72,000 workers get laid off in the railway, for example. And that's a tremendous motivator for you. And it fits right into my teaching plan, too. What I want them to think about is the political economy of privatization, the importance of the politics as well as the economics, the importance of taking seriously, for example, the fact that 72,000 railway workers lost their job in the name of economic reform and what the implications of that are. So this is a big win. Let me ask about this. Over the course of the class, their understanding of that issue changes enormously. And the students get worried about that. They think that just because their understanding is changed, because they come out of the class with a different understanding than they entered into the class, that they're not so smart. And I always tell them that the cases wouldn't be worth discussing if they didn't change your mind a little bit, if they didn't expand your mind. That's just natural.
It's like reinforcing.
What you want students to realize is that you're prepared to talk about the richness of the case, not just from your disciplinary perspective, but from the broader perspective of society as a whole. The last block often gets shortchanged just because the conversations are so interesting in the other blocks. But it's important to allow enough time for the last block. We're getting close to the end here. Let me ask you about the second topic that I wanted you to think about, the concession system. The last block is often one of the most important ones, the one you were building up to. And that's why it's important to keep your eye on the clock. And the popular support for that concession system as well. We're running late, so we can continue this conversation next class, but let me just sum up. The wrap-up, or the last 5 minutes of the case, are really important. What you want to do is use it as an opportunity to lay out the issues that you think the conversation raised and that you want them to go away thinking about and to be able to apply in new cases. These issues aren't facts. They're usually concepts or trade-offs or ways of thinking about a problem. What do I want you to remember? I essentially want you to remember 3 things from this case. One is to think about the political economy of privatization, about who wins and who loses, and to be intellectually honest about it, right? And to understand that the pattern varies, and that the pattern is to some degree under your control and is going to influence both how you sleep at night and whether you keep your job if you're in one of these privatization units. I think the second thing is to think incentives, right? Students sometimes ask me in the middle of the course if I can't hand them out my takeaways for every class, put them down on paper and give them to them at the end of the class. And I say no, because for every student the takeaway is going to be slightly different. I give my version, but I guarantee you in their notes it's colored by their interpretation of the conversation that we had and tailored to their needs and their experiences. Other instructors sometimes ask me, why bother with case teaching? It seems so inefficient, and it seems risky as well, because you lose control of the class. And I say, you don't really lose control if you have a good teaching plan. If you understand the blocks that you need to have in the conversation and where to go. And it's much more fun than just lecturing. So it's amazing that they did this. It's more fun in part because you're more engaged than you would be when you're just delivering a lecture. Focus on this from later. And the students are a heck of a lot more engaged than they would be in a lecture. Is this enough?